Welcome back to Call Time with Katie Birnbaum. Thanks again for watching week in and week out. It's been so fun for me to host and produce the show and to connect with a larger theater loving audience. I'm really excited for our episode today. I've long admired my guest. He has the kind of unique career in theater that I envy. I'm sure many other people envy, and I'd love to emulate someday. In fact, looking at some of his credits and doing research for the interview, I found myself getting some stage fright for the interview. He's just this legendary giant of modern American theater. So I'm sure we're going to get into all of that and more later. But for now, I'm thrilled to introduce the wonderful Jack Viertel. How are you? Thanks for coming.
Thank you for such a fulsome introduction. I'm fine and glad to be here.
Well, we're not even done with the introductions
Oh
because
no.
this way you don't have to do your own and sort of toot your own horn, and I can do it for you. Jack is a theatrical producer, librettist, dramaturg, and creative consultant. He's the senior vice president of Jujamcyn Theaters, and in that regard has shepherded multiple Pulitzer Prize and Tony-winning shows to Broadway since 1987, including City of Angels, Angels in America. Maybe you love shows with angels in the title. We can come
Always
back to
happy to have those, yeah.
that. Multiple August Wilson plays. He was the artistic director of City Center Encores from 2000 to 2020, overseeing the production of over 60 shows, and in some cases, adapting the scripts or even writing the scripts or coming up with the concepts, as he did for the long-running Smokey Joe's Cafe song cycle and After Midnight. And if you weren't already asking yourself, is there anything this man can't do? He's also served as a crucial creative consultant on shows like Hairspray, Christmas Story, and Dear Evan Hansen. He started out as a dramaturg at the Mark Taper Forum and as the arts editor at the Los Angeles Herald Examiner. He teaches at NYU Tisch, and he wrote a book about all of these experiences and more. One of my favorite nonfiction reads about the theater I've ever read, called The Secret Life of the American Musical.
Yes, I did in fact work on all those shows. You didn't mention all the flops, of which there are quite a number, but
Well, maybe we'll get into
we
that
can get into
later.
that later. Yeah.
But that's actually relates to one of the first things I wanted to ask you, because you're one of the guests that I've had where coming up with your bio, I've been like, oh my God, I'm going to miss something because you've done so much. Your career is so impressive, both longevity wise and breadth wise.
Oh, thank you.
And you wear many different hats, which I think is one of the coolest parts for me. So my first question is, did you approach your theatrical career being like, I want to do it all, I want to do everything? Or did the chips sort of fall where they would in this sort of unique way?
Much more the latter than the former. And I would even say that it happened that way in part because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought for a minute that I would be a screenwriter. That didn't work out.
Oh,
Um, I became a theater critic completely by accident because a friend of mine from college knew somebody who was starting a newspaper and they needed a theater critic and they paid me $35 a week. It was a free newspaper. And then the Herald Examiner hired me because I'd written all these theater reviews. I had no idea. I didn't even know what a portfolio meant in those days. Um, and then they made me the arts editor, and I realized I was in the wrong business. I was in the newspaper business. I didn't want to be in the newspaper business. I was only writing theater reviews because I cared about the theater. So um, I jumped ship to the Mark Taper, where they had just lost their dramaturg at the exact moment when I realized I didn't want to be in the newspaper business. So that was kind of fortuitous. And then Rocco Landisman called me from Jujamcyn the day it was announced that had taken over as president and invited me to come to New York uh, and work there. And I didn't really know why he would invite me. I had met him once in my life. And he said, well, you wrote back when you were a critic, you wrote this terrible review of Big River when it was trying out in La Jolla. And we used it to fix the show, or we used parts of it to fix the show. Um, and so I think you're a smart person, and we have to fill these 5 theaters, and I need you to come to New York and be a producer for Jujamcyn. And that was one area of the theater that I had never really thought about doing. But, when Broadway calls, to paraphrase Angels in America, you go. So
right.
I moved from Los Angeles, and, the rest of it just sort of followed on from there. I didn't know what Encores didn't exist. I had no idea what that was going to be when they invited me to join an exploratory committee of people who were trying to figure out how to do music theater at City Center. One thing leads to another.
That's so interesting. And I feel like a lot of people who have those kinds of theatrical careers, it just sort of one thing, domino effect, one thing leads to another. But did you always know you wanted to be in theater since you were a kid?
Yes, since I was a little, well, yes, since I was a little kid. I mean, my parents and my grandmother took me to Peter Pan when I was 5.
That was my first show.
And probably not the same production I saw,
Absolutely not.
1954. Um, and right then, I mean, I was a little kid. I remember, I thought this is, I want this to go on forever. I want to be doing this forever. There was this brief moment in the early 70s when I was just out of college and just married, when the movies were having an incredible renaissance. It was the earliest days of
Right.
Coppola and Scorsese and Altman and Spielberg. And I mean, all those guys were starting out. And so for a brief moment, I became a movie fanatic. I mean, I am a movie fanatic, but I became one in terms of what I wanted to do with my life, and decided I would be a screenwriter. And I wrote some terrible screenplays. I had no idea how to write a screenplay. I wrote them anyway. And this was long before computers. So you wrote them on a typewriter with, erasable paper. And it was just a mistake. I mean, it was, I became infatuated. Theater critic, I thought, I sat down and wrote my first theater review, which was a review of the touring production of Annie at the Schubert Theater in Los Angeles. And I thought, I know exactly how to do this. After years of writing screenplays and thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just like flying blind here. I
Right.
sat down to write this review. And at the end of it, I thought, that's a review. I know how to do this.
You started out as a writer and then were producing and artistic directing for many years, and then you wrote this book. First of all, do you think writing your skill sets as a writer helped you as a producer?
Yes. Yeah, I always thought of myself as a writer, well, from the time I started writing reviews, or even mistakenly from the time I started writing screenplays. And I had written The Great American Novel as an undergraduate in college, which thankfully never got published. It probably isn't The Great American Novel. It's in a box downstairs in the basement. So I always thought of myself as a writer. I mean, I, the issue was really that I was, and I say this with no false modesty, I was only moderately talented. But I just didn't have a great imagination. I wasn't ever going to be August Wilson or Tony Kushner or Arthur Miller. The best I could hope to be was a decent craftsman who could learn from practice. But I knew how to write an English sentence, and I had a certain rhythm to the writing that was easy and conversational. And so I think that having tried to write in so many forms was really helpful as a producer, because it gave me the ability to look at a scene and say, I think it goes wrong here, or I think this actually isn't a scene because it doesn't have these elements in it. Things that I think a lot of producers don't do because their training is different and their talents are different. I mean, when I say I have only a moderate talent as a writer, I have absolutely no talent as a marketer or a manager. I mean, I can't add or subtract, and other people have to do that. But I do have an understanding of material.
I was going to ask you, because I think producer, obviously everyone throws around the term producer, but I actually don't think a lot of people have a really strong sense of what that means on Broadway. So do you have a definition of what that means and what it's meant in your career?
Well, it means a lot of different things. And of course, a lot of different people do it in groups now, so that you don't have to be the person who does it all. I think when David Merrick and Hal Prince started out producing, they did do it all. They understood the budget really in detail. There were managers and there were ad agencies and press agents and things like that, but the producer really had to understand all of these things in addition to raising the money, in addition to uh, understanding material to the degree possible. And that isn't so much true anymore because there are so many partners, and also so many professional agencies and companies that work with you as a producer, so that there really is somebody doing all those jobs, each of those jobs, as opposed to one person doing all of those jobs. But a producer for me uh, is first and foremost someone who is passionate about a piece of material, or conceives a piece of material, or reads a piece of material and falls in love with it, or sees a movie or reads a novel and thinks, I know how to make this into a musical. They aren't actually the writers, but they understand what it should be. And it's interesting, people don't really know how many of the great classical musicals, less true of plays, were the brainchildren of the producer, not of the writers. I mean, Guys and Dolls was invented by Fuhr and Martin, and My Fair Lady was invented by producers who went out and found writers to write them. With plays, it's more like you read a play. Like I read M. Butterfly right before I went to work for Jujamcyn and thought, this is fantastic. We have to find a way to do this. Um, and then you have an influence on that script to the degree that you say anything smart about it, but it has an author. Musicals don't really have an author. They have three writers, none of whom, sometimes two, sometimes one, very occasionally, but they feel more like they're constructed than the total output of one brain. Whereas a play usually is that.
Mm.
So a producer grabs hold of it, or a producer comes up with an idea and causes something to be created as a piece of material, and then has to go out and raise the money and do all the mechanical things, figure out the marketing and make a theater deal and all of that. But at the same time, producing in partnership with a director, I would say, goes to the question of things like, what's the look and the feel of this piece? Who's the right designers to do all of that work? What is this event we're trying to make? And the producers really, I would say the producer is like the commander in chief, and the director is like the five-star general. The director actually runs the whole thing and reports back to the producer. And the producer, if he's smart, usually doesn't get in the middle of the five-star general's war plan, but he knows what it is every step of the way, and has to know what it is every step of the way. And then I'm sorry, this answer is so long, but you asked a good question. And then there's the whole question of running the show. I mean, so far all I've talked about is like getting the show to opening night.
Right.
What happens if you're Barry Weissler and you have to keep Chicago going for 30 years? That's a whole other job that a producer does. And you do it in conjunction with a marketing agency and an advertising agency and a press agency, and whatever brilliant ideas you can come up with casting ideas that come from a casting director or casting director's office. The producer is sort of that album cover of My Fair Lady with George Bernard Shaw holding the strings for the puppets. You got to be in charge of all of that at some level. You don't have to be in the weeds with every single piece of it. But it's a big job, and it requires a lot of different hats.
Yeah, and I think Broadway producing specifically is like a very unique beast. What would you say are the differences between producing at a Broadway sort of for-profit level versus, let's say, an off-Broadway nonprofit or a regional nonprofit?
Well, I think they're really different. If you were at a regional nonprofit or a New York nonprofit like the Public or MCC or someplace,
Yeah.
um, you're not raising money from people to whom you have to say, if we're a hit, you'll get this money back. You're telling
Right.
right up front, you're not going to get this money back. And so it's a different kind of money raising around a passion for a mission, as opposed to a passion for a successful show. And to that degree, a theater has an overall plan for a year or 5 years or whatever, and no one production is the sole reason for their existence.
Hmm.
So you're never looking at, like when I was at the Taper, we were never looking at a show. We were looking at a show in the context of the 5 shows that would be our 5 main stage shows.
Right.
And this one has to be, have some romance in it, because this one is just an angry screed, and this one is a comedy, and they're all going to run 64 performances no matter what anybody says, no more and no less. So your passion can't be about, I want this show to run for 30 years. It has to be, I want the mission of this theater to be fulfilled in a way that nourishes our audience year in and year out. We have an idea of what the theater should be. Whereas as a commercial producer, you're dealing with a show.
Right. And I assume it's interesting you brought up the subject of audience, because as you're saying, if you're, you know, the CEO or artistic director of a regional theater, you have a sort of strong sense of who your audience is. And I guess if you should have a strong sense of who the audience is if you're a commercial Broadway producer, but it's sort of more like, let's try to get everyone to come, as many people to come as possible. Would you say that's true?
Yes, I mean, I think in the years when I started doing it, which was the late 80s and the 90s, we were very clear about um, doing a certain number of shows that that would have a specific type of audience.
Mm.
Would not be. We were not trying to get tourists from Europe and Asia to go see the new August Wilson play.
Right.
We were trying to get them to come see the producers, but not, but we knew that we were doing some plays for one reason and some plays for another reason. And your marketing is directed toward audiences who you think will want to see it. This is a serious play audience type of play. This is a widest, lowest common denominator type of musical. And of course, every stop in between. I'm not making judgments about one kind of show versus another. I'm just saying you should know what kind of theater you're producing and how to find the audience that wants to see it.
I'm sure you followed in the pandemic, there's been a lot of discussion and sort of hand wringing in the theater community about the relationship between nonprofit and commercial theater, and the question of like, why is there no, you know, national theater equivalent in the United States? First of all, do you think that there should be, or at least more federal funding for the theater? And then secondly, do you think that the relationship between commercial and nonprofit theater is symbiotic, like they need each other?
Yeah, yes, there should be way more funding than there is from I mean, I think I would prefer the British model or French model in which the arts are considered a necessity the same way that an army is considered a necessity. We
Right.
don't do that in this country. We're not going to do it. I harbor no false hope that this is all going to change. But it's funny. I don't really think there should be a national theater because I think one of the glories of the American theater is it can be regional. You
Yeah.
can't do, I mean, I remember when I was living in LA, actually right before I became a critic, and Zoot Suit was done at the Mark Taper Forum. Zoot Suit was a play about the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles, which were essentially, a white supremacist attack on Mexican Americans in LA among a group of Mexican Americans who were entrenched in LA. That play, which sold every ticket and had lines around the block every night of its life, simply wouldn't have been the same thing in Kansas City, or as it turned out in New York, where it played a very brief run on Broadway.
Right.
There was an ability to make theater for the community that the community wanted to see, and I think that's actually more valuable than than a national theater that tries to be all things to all people. That's easier in some place like Great Britain, I think, because it's a much smaller country.
Right.
And yet, even so, I would say the National Theatre of Great Britain is not particularly responsive to what's going on in Scotland a lot of the time, but it's a theater that has a tradition of Shakespeare and Jacobean tragedy, and there's an English theater tradition that it's upholding. It's not the only. It's not serving communities the way our local theaters can.
No, I think that's true. I think one of the saddest parts of the pandemic has been hoping that all these amazing regional theaters survive, because you
Yeah.
really need it. You need it everywhere. I want to shift a little bit to Encores.
Okay.
Long before I did worked on a show there, it was one of my favorite like New York institutions. Um, so I know you were around when the idea germinated. Can you tell me, or were you?
Yeah. Well, not at the very, very beginning, but shortly thereafter. The idea germinated at a lunch between Judith Dakin, who was in charge of City Center, and Ted Chapin, who was in charge of the Rodgers and Hammerstein organization. She wanted to figure out how to get musical theater into City Center, which had once had a thriving musical theater program in the 50s and 60s, I think beginning in the late 40s even. How to get it back on their stage. And so she had a lunch with Ted, and she really conceived of in the broadest sense, the idea of Encores. But the decision they made was that they would form a small committee of people with differing skills to talk about what that thing should be that would be up on the stage. And they had a couple of meetings before Ted called me. We were social friends and professional friends, and said, I realized the one thing we don't have on this committee is anybody who knows how to produce a show. We have theater historians, we have a music director, we have, but someone who's actually produced a whole show from beginning to end, we don't have anybody like that. So would you join the committee? So I joined the committee. And from there on out, I was part of it. I would say probably from the 5th or 6th meeting, which was probably a year before the series actually happened.
Oh, it's the best. One thing I find fascinating about it is, it was, as you know, it was originally designed to be presented this super short rehearsal process and concert style presentations. Although I would say concert style has definitely been elevated even in the years since I started seeing encore shows. Do you think there's an increased creative value to that super quick, sort of less production value style and process?
I think it proved to be, it started out totally as a pragmatic reality. The board of City Center would only provide a certain amount of money. We looked at the amount of
Oh,
money,
really? Oh,
tried to whack it
interesting.
up as like, okay, so what's important to us? Well, the most important thing is to have the orchestra be the full orchestra playing the original orchestrations and the songs well sung. So it really did start out as a concert, almost concert presentation. When the first show they did, they played all the dance music from Fiorello, but they only choreographed one dance. The rest of the dance music was played while the cast stood on stage staring at the orchestra, who were very beautifully lit. But there was no money to do anything. So as there got to be a little bit more money, as it became more successful, uh, everybody wanted to do more. And we had to sort of, the process was a strange push me, pull you of wanting to do more and not wanting to do too much, trying to hold back a director or a designer who had a really grand plan and saying, you only have 9 days of rehearsal. You'll never pull that off. But on the other hand, it sounds pretty cool. Sort of wish you could do it. Maybe you could do a little of it. And then over the years, it just grew, I think maybe a little too much, but by the same token, one of the things that's really fun in the theater is surprise. And how do you surprise an audience that is a subscription audience that's been loyally coming for 15 years? You do something you haven't done before. You hurl them a different kind of bouquet, and so it just kept happening in different ways. Mostly to the good, I think. Occasionally a little over elaborate.
A crucial thing that obviously I noticed and thought was interesting when I worked there was obviously because of the quick process. There are no previews really. That's sort of like the magical time when you're seeing how the
Right.
audience reacts and stuff like that. Do you think that's obviously unique to Encores? Do you miss the preview process when you do it?
You miss it in at least one way. Well, maybe two ways. You do get the way it works is we do an invited dress rehearsal on a Wednesday night. We open on Thursday night. On Thursday afternoon, you get 5 hours of rehearsal. If you look at it on Wednesday night and think, if I had 4 weeks of previews, I would change these 85 things, but I got to change these 2 things. They're just big mistakes that we've made or things that we'll never pull off. You can then cut them, trim them, reshape them in some way or other over those 5. It's only 5 hours. That's all you got. So yes, would the shows would be, there'd be more subtle decision making going on if you had lots of previews and time to implement whatever changes you wanted to make. On the other hand, there is an adrenaline-like quality to this that's very different than a show that's been running for a while. It just, I don't know what's different about it exactly. There's an energy coming from the performers who aren't 100% sure where they're supposed to stand or when they're supposed to walk in or out, or what that lyric really is. But the audience is tremendously supportive, and it's like we're all in this together. Curtain goes
Yeah.
up, this light hits the back of Rob Berman's head, and he starts conducting the overture. And it's like, okay, it's like a baseball game. We don't know who's going to win. We're just going to get out there and swing. And there's a real value to that in the live theater. Not to take away from the other situation in which something is polished to within an inch of its life, but it's really fun for an audience and it's really fun for the performers, I think 99% of the time. The other thing that I should just mention is every now and then, not that often, but every now and then, I have looked at a Wednesday dress rehearsal and thought, man, we just missed this one by a country mile. Now that I see it up on its feet, I know what kind of show it's supposed to be, and we've produced it as some other kind of show. And
Interesting.
there's nothing you can do about it. If you had 4 weeks of previews, you might be able to correct that problem. Whether it's the design or the whole approach or the casting, usually you can't correct that problem, even with a 4. If you make that mistake, you're usually stuck with it, no matter how many previews you have. But I have seen it get measurably better in a show that has a lot of previews, and I have seen it not get better at all with no previews.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's live theater. You sort of don't really know what you have until you
Yeah,
are in previews and have an audience. It's like this weird beast that you don't know what kind of thing it is yet. And then suddenly you see it. And sometimes that's really good and exciting. And sometimes you're like, oh, yikes.
yeah,
Um, but obviously, you've spent a large portion of your life running Encores. And um, there is this growing, not growing, but there is a camp of people who, especially at this moment in time when we're having all these discussions about racial, gender, ethnic equity, are questioning um, the value in doing things like Shakespeare or Golden Age musicals or long forgotten musicals when we could be doing new work and grappling with all these current issues in society and the ways that theater can address it. What do you think you would say to those people, slash what is the value for you in excavating these old gems?
well, I think there were any number of values, but the first thing I would say is I don't disagree with that, with much of that point of view. I think that a lot of what we did essentially as a kind of living museum um, promoted values and ideas about life that we really are not comfortable with anymore. Um, we got uncomfortable with them quite quickly and over a relatively short period of time, at least as a general population.
Mm,
Um, so I mean, I stepped down from Encores because it was clear to me that this was beginning to happen, and then it happened, over the course of the pandemic year, it happened hugely. That it was going to take another kind of, probably much younger, probably brought up on a different kind of theater head and heart to figure out what to do with these shows.
mm,
That said, it is in many ways the American songbook and the history of the way Americans wanted to be entertained, thought about what was important to them, even in a light-hearted musical. I mean, I take light-hearted musicals very seriously. This is what they wanted, or this is what their creators of this show thought they wanted, because it reinforced certain values and it introduced certain new values that would be embraced. And I think it's really important not to lose track of that. I
mm.
don't think we have to pretend that all those values are still as valuable to us today as they were to my parents in 1945. But I'm completely opposed to to saying we shouldn't do those things anymore. I think we need to do them in the context of what they meant then and what they might mean now. I mean, the famous production of Oklahoma that was done a couple of years ago that tried to do that exact thing in a very specific way. Um, I'm not saying all shows should be done like that. I think sometimes you can glean from the show, done as it was originally done, information that's valuable to knowing where we're headed next. But it's become a much more complicated reality. I do think that there's a tremendous amount of new work being done, and uh, all through the life of Encores, there was a tremendous amount of new work being done. I never felt that there wasn't enough new work being explored or that resources were being wasted on classic work.
Right.
Classic work tells us what new work can be, and that distribution didn't bother me so much. What I do feel is that a lot of the values, a lot of the jokes, a lot of the sort of subject matter in those classic shows, I'm not talking about Shakespeare, I'm talking about Golden Age musicals, are worth holding up to a light and saying, what does this actually mean? What is this actually saying?
I really like what you say because you basically treat it like history, which I think it is. As you say, it's a document um, that reveals more. You're not really like interpreting the show. It reveals more about the people who were going to see it and who wrote it than it does doing sort of like an English major analysis of the
Right.
play, which I think is important because obviously history, if you don't learn it, you're bound to repeat it. Um, and I also love what you say about taking even lighthearted comedies, musical comedies, really seriously, because I'm definitely a musical comedy person as well. And I think that's increasingly rare. And I'm curious what I know what draws me to it, but I'm curious what draws you to it when so many people find, especially older musical comedies, sort of corny or treacly.
Well, they are in a sense. I mean,
Right.
um, it's not so much a question of what their values are as of what your values are. I sat down last night and watched, not last night, a few nights ago, and watched Smith and Dale on the Ed Sullivan Show doing Dr. Cronkite and His Only Living Patient, which is a vaudeville sketch from the 20s. And corny it is. But I wanted to feel the rhythm of what those vaudeville sketches were like. It's the vaudeville sketch that basically got rewritten by Neil Simon for the Sunshine Boys. I think there's something magical about that stuff. There's something absolutely magical about that stuff. And part of it is, how do we know what makes us laugh or what gives us joy? How do we define it? I mean, some of this stuff is genuinely mysterious. It's operating on your brain and your heart and your nervous system in some way that it cannot be defined, I don't think. I love those old musical comedies. I mean, the one we worked on together was one of the oldest and perhaps corniest and perhaps most sexist and uh, appalling in some ways ever written. And yet there was tremendous joy in knowing that there was an unafraidness about saying all those things and doing all those things in 1930, some of which we're now afraid of and some of which we don't approve of. And we have to weigh all those things. That we get to do that.
You have to judge like what is going to be comedy for comedy's sake and what is going to be comedy that's no longer palatable for today's
Right.
audiences. And I think making those choices is tough and takes a real expert. But I really like what you say about, yeah, it's almost like a physical response to jokes that are almost not even cerebral. They're like in your body, these jokes from these
Yeah.
old
Yeah.
shows. Um, I
There's a kind of human behavior. If you look at old vaudevillians or even new vaudevillians, it's different from stand-up comedy. There's something about the way people move and the cadences that they speak in that take material that if you read it on the page, you would think, why bother? And you just see there's a human gift in those people to make you laugh and to make you see something about yourself. I don't want to throw that away.
You obviously see musical theater as super connected to its vaudeville roots. Um, but obviously musical theater as it exists now has gone leaps and bounds from vaudeville. Similarly, what do you, as someone who's worked in the theater for a long time, what do you see as the future of American musical theater? I know that's a big question.
Well, uh, I, I don't have a lot. I don't have, I mean, it never comes out the way you think it's going to. So I'm, I'm going to jump around that question in a way, but I will say this about that. Um, One of the things that I started to notice a few years ago was that resident theaters, regional theaters around the country were doing more and more musicals, but they weren't doing, the funny thing happened on the way to the forum, they were doing musicals about that were more serious and smaller and more modest in scope and more serious in intent. And I began to realize that audiences love music theater, not necessarily musical comedy. They love it, I think, in part because it's combines so many elements. It's music and it's lyrics and it's design and it's lighting and it's great singers as well as great actors. And little by little, it became clear to me that things that have become musicals in the last 10 years, 15 years, 50 years ago or 40 years ago would all have been plays. None of them would have been
Interesting.
musicals. Fun Home would have been a play. Dear Evan Hansen would have been a play. It would not have been a musical. It would never
Right.
have occurred to anybody to make a musical out of that kind of material. So where the musical is going, I think, is toward total flexibility. When you look at something like The Great Comet or Hadestown, or it can be anything. Musicals in the golden age were musicals. There was an overture, there were 8 numbers in act 1, there were 5 numbers in act 2, there were 2 reprises, there were 2 big dance numbers, and the hero and the heroine, they kissed at the end and the curtain came down, or they died at the end and the curtain came down on rare occasions. But now it's anything, and it's really, really fascinating and exciting, I think.
What do you see as like, when do you feel like that transition began to happen? Is there like a show that you see as like the nexus
It
or
happened while I wasn't looking. That's all I can say. I wasn't paying attention.
yeah.
I'm trying to think of the first one that I felt that way about. The first one I felt that way about might have been Next to Normal, but I don't think that was the first one.
Yeah.
I
Interesting.
looked at Next to Normal and I said, somebody wrote a musical about, you know, a mentally ill person and a dead child. They wrote a musical about this. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's, you know, but I'm sure there were others before that I just didn't, I don't think anybody thought up this trend.
No, of course. Of
They
course.
just started working on a show and they thought, I'll write a show about this, or I'll
Yeah.
produce a show about this. And as a result, it's really, really a different world. I mean, in some ways, the first one I worked on that was like that was Jelly's Last Jam, which I worked on very early in my career. I mean, I was only at Jujamcyn for a couple of years when that happened. And, it's a funny show. I mean, nobody does it anymore, but it's an angry, angry show with a tap dancer in the middle of it. Now, tap dance and anger in the classic days never went together. And when they started to go together, they started to go together in some sort of
Now they
ironic
have Billy
way.
Elliot, the ultimate tap
I know
maker.
but I mean, that was a show that was like, we don't really know what we're doing. We're trying to do something that we don't know what it is, and it's new and it's bizarrely exciting and also terribly frightening because it could just turn out to be a train wreck.
Right.
And that was thrilling,
When you,
scary, thrilling.
this is going back a little, but it just made me think of this question as you were just talking. When you're resurrecting a show for, let's say, Encores, even something like the New Yorkers that we did together, are you thinking of it like a revival, or are you thinking of it like an entirely new piece?
It depends on the piece. In the case of the New Yorkers, there really was no extant performable book.
Right.
Even parts of the score were missing. So that was newer in a sense, in that we had to make a show where no show existed
Right.
quite. I mean, there had been a show, but no one knew what it was, and it was
Right.
80 years earlier. With a revival of a show like, oh, I don't know, Finian's Rainbow or Brigadoon, yes, then you're reviving a piece of material that's, even if it hasn't been seen in many years, is well worn. It has a script, it has a score, it has orchestrations, it has you're trying to figure out how to do it in an imaginative way that will engage today's audiences, but you're glued to the original material in some way or other, and trying to feature the original material. We at Encores always wanted to feature the original material in the way that it was originally intended. We weren't doing what that
Right.
production of Oklahoma did, which was to re-examine it through a different lens. We were trying to find the original lens
Right.
and let the audience take it where they wanted to.
Interesting. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like the last aspect of your career that we haven't really touched on is your capacity as a creative consultant on various shows. And I'm curious what that means for you. When I think of it, to me, and based on reading your book, it seems like you were sort of like a theatrical fixer, like someone who comes in and says, like, this is the problem with Act Two, and this is what you need to do to Act One. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I mean, it's different in every case. You know, when I was, and it depends a lot on where I entered the process. Um, I mean, just as an example, on A Christmas Story, which I worked on a few years before Dear Evan Hansen. I referenced the two of them together because the same composer and
Yeah.
lyricist. There had already been a production of this version of A Christmas Story in Washington State, in Seattle. They wanted to get the show to Broadway. They felt it wasn't ready for Broadway. I was hired to come in and sit with the writers and the director and the choreographer and work through what existed, um, to try to reorder it in some ways, to try to trim it in some ways, to try to identify places where a new number might be written. Um, and those were just big meetings in a room with 5 or 6 people sitting around a table for 3 hours and going out and having a sandwich and doing it for another 3 hours. On Dear Evan Hansen, I was brought to the lead producer, Stacy Mindich's apartment with Pasek and Paul, who she wanted to support. And she said to them, I want to produce the musical that you've always wanted to write that no one has ever wanted to produce. What is it? So that there was nothing.
Wow.
Justin said, we've always talked about the fact that this kid um, committed suicide in my high school, and it caused a lot of problems for some other kids who didn't know how to feel about it. And there's a show in there somewhere. And it started that early. So on that show, at least until it was almost fully formed, I was part of the process of picking the book writer. I was part of the process of going through every draft that got written, the outlines first, and then the drafts. It was a much more thorough job, but it can be anything. The main thing is, I guess, if I have something to contribute, it's the fact that I've done a lot of shows and that I've seen where a lot of problems come from and how they got solved. And
Mm.
so if you're doing a show and you're less experienced, um, I often can say, well, here's a possible solution for this, or here's something it seems to me it hasn't been dealt with yet. Um, I often tell this story, but on Hairspray, which was enormous fun to work on, the original book writer, Mark O'Donnell, and the Shaman and Whitman, who wrote the score, turned in a draft that Mark O'Donnell completely found the voice of that piece, and Shaman and Whitman kept that voice in exactly the same place for the score. They were so focused, and the show was, the score was delightful, and the show was sort of going to be a hit almost no matter what from the first time we did a reading of Act One. They were so focused on that voice of what the show is supposed to sound like and feel like, and the politics of the piece, that they actually forgot to write the romance. They actually forgot to write the important parts about Tracy Turnblad and Link Larkin. And so, I was in a position after reading to say, there's got to be a song where she says, I love this guy. And there's got to be, they have to break up and then they have to get back together. And they just weren't thinking about that part of it. It wasn't that important to them. And
Right.
so I didn't say, do this, do this, do this. I just said, I think that, there's that romantic thread that's supposed to get you from A to Z is actually missing. And they went away and they wrote I Can Hear the Bells, and they wrote Without Love, and they made, had the breakup at the end of Act One, little by little. And I can't take credit for their having done any of that, but I was able to sort of isolate and say, this is where there's nothing wrong with the work that's been done, but you haven't done this work yet. This
Yeah.
other part of the work.
It's so funny. I was just talking about Hairspray this morning with some friends about how it's such an incredible show. And this is a little off topic, and probably not your decision at all, but I'll never forget being a kid and seeing the vertical bed in the opening number.
I don't know who invented that. It sure as hell wasn't me. It might have been Jerry Mitchell and Jack O'Brien together, but
It was incredible for me as a kid. That was like,
yeah.
oh my God.
Well, why that's theater, right? I mean, you look at it and you think this is not a movie. This is not a TV show. This is an abstract representation of a reality that you can really only do on stage.
Totally. And like such a specific viewpoint. Like from the moment the curtain rose, you kind of knew what the show was going to be like, literally just from the bed placement.
Yeah.
But my second thing, based on what you said, is that It seems like your capacity as creative consultant is sort of like using everything you've learned in all your different jobs in theater, because you're sort of using your knowledge as a producer, your knowledge as a writer, your knowledge as a dramaturg, and like putting it all together. Is that fair to say, do you think?
Yes, but I think as much as anything else, it's what I learned from being a critic.
Yes.
Seeing 4 shows a week, about 3, 4, sometimes 5 shows a week, having to write about them on deadline and turn in copy. And over time, without really, it's like osmosis. I didn't set out to learn any specific things, but you see a lot of shows that don't work, and you see a lot of shows that do work. See a lot of shows that work part of the time, but not all the time. And little by little, it's just like you begin to digest that material, and you can spot places where the work isn't finished yet. And I did this just to not make me sound like a complete hedonist. I did this with August Wilson. I did it with Tony Kushner to some extent. It wasn't just musicals.
Of
Um,
course.
I worked on M Butterfly, as I said earlier. It's the process is not that different between a
Yeah.
play and on M Butterfly. I say this in my book, but for anyone who hasn't read it, which you certainly don't have to,
Everyone should read it.
the show was trying out in Washington, and Stuart Ostro, who was producing it, called me and he said, "There's an emotional gap in the second to last scene. I don't know what it is. Can you get on a train and come down here and look at it? Talk to me about it." And literally over drinks after seeing the show that night, I'd already seen the show, 5 times, but I wasn't living in Washington with it. We figured it out. Just figured
Yeah.
it out. David went away and rewrote that one scene. Made a huge difference.
That's where the magic happens, often over drinks after the show.
Yeah.
My last question before we do a little ending segment, which should be fun, sort of bringing things, but maybe fun, maybe fun for me, not for you. Sort of bringing it full circle to my first question. Do you have advice for people who want to mold some sort of conglomerate, I do everything theatrical career path, sort of in the way that you did?
I have stupid advice. The only advice I have is to just keep saying yes. I said yes to jobs that I thought were not really right for me, to things that I didn't know how interested I was, but they were in the theater and I wanted to be in the theater, and I had the time and I wasn't employed, and you just say yes. I mean, the first job I really had was I volunteered at the Los Angeles Shakespeare Festival, which was an attempt to imitate the Delacorte, the New York Shakespeare Festival in the
Yeah.
park. And the first thing that happened was the artistic director and the managing director got in an incredible fight. The artistic director walked out. He wouldn't give back all the audition material for the next show. He had it at his house. The managing director was too cowardly to call him, having already shouted at him, and the guy left the room. And so I ended up having to go, talk this guy into giving me back them. But I don't know. I learned a lot of something from that job. I don't know what exactly, but just
Yeah.
say yes.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And you often end up doing, as you say, stuff that you're not prepared for, you have no idea how it's going to help you down the line. But I think it all, especially if you want to do everything, it all sort of informs each other, because as you say, some of it is people skills and management skills and learning how to collaborate.
Yeah.
All right. So I always end with a segment called the Thank You 5 segment, which is 5 rapid fire questions that you're just supposed to answer off the top of your head. You may not like it because it's a lot of favorites, but you can pick a couple. Favorite golden age musical and favorite contemporary musical.
Favorite golden age musical. If Follies counts in the golden age, that's the answer to that question. If it doesn't, I think I would have to say Guys and Dolls. Favorite contemporary musical. That's tough. Caroline or Change.
Really excellent choices. This will be hard, but you can say a couple. Favorite show that you've ever worked on in any capacity, play or musical.
Angels in America.
Also an excellent answer. I mean, I could do a whole other episode just asking you about Angels in America.
I say that with a little bit of trepidation because I really want to say the piano lesson at the same time, but
Well, now you've mentioned it, honorable mention. Is there a show that you didn't get to do at Encores that you think could still be mined for a resurrection for future productions or adaptations? Because I know you have, if I haven't yet said this, an absolutely bottomless knowledge of most theater.
I would just say there are 4 shows that I had an interest in doing at Encores that I didn't do before I stepped down. And I'm not going to tell you what they are because I may still get to do them.
Okay, that's exciting. I'm looking forward to it. Is one of them Flahuli?
No,
That was a trip to read and listen to.
I
Um,
bet.
is there a theater writer or composer from any time that you think gets short shrift, like doesn't get the credit that you think is due?
That's a hard question. Well, I think it depends on what you mean by short shrift. If you're talking about a theater composer, for instance, who is as great as any theater composer, great as any composer of American songs, but is not often thought of as being that person, it's Harold Arlen and Johnny Mercer, his often partner. But those are not obscure people. If you're looking for obscure
Right.
people, I don't know that I have any obscure people. I'd have to really think about that. And I don't think I'd want to go on the record just shooting my mouth off. I don't know what to call it. An abiding fondness for Moose Charlap, who
I
is
don't know who that is.
Moose Charlap, whose real name was actually Morris Charlap, I think, but who was known as Mark Charlap. Uh, wrote 3 or 4 shows, all of them flops, except for he wrote the original score, as much as there was of it, for the Mary Martin Peter Pan. He wrote some of those songs. He wrote "I'm Flying," for instance, but he wrote a show called Whoop Up. He wrote a show called The Conquering Hero. He wrote a magnificent flop called Kelly, which was at the time was the biggest flop of all time. And there's some damn good writing in it.
Huh.
But you don't find a lot of Mark Charlap fans or Morris Charlap or Moose Charlap fans out there. I keep him in my heart somehow or other.
Well, maybe they'll all the Moose Charlotte fans will flood to the comments now that we've mentioned him in the video. And my last question, one thing, I'm sure there are many things, but one thing you're looking forward to as theater looks to reopen.
Well, the thing I'm looking forward to most is not a specific show. It's the experience of sitting with 1,000 people in the dark when the curtain goes up, if there's a curtain. And actually, I pray there's a curtain. There should be a curtain.
I hope there's a curtain too.
And being able to sit with those people and have that experience, which to me is as close as I get to a religious experience or a church experience, that's what I'm looking forward to. I hope it's a good show. But even if it's not a good show, it's still the thing I'm looking forward to most.
Me too. Me too. I can't wait. I was just discussing it with some friends today. Well, Jack, thank you so much for being on the show. Do you think there's anything I've missed? Any glaring blanks in your career and life?
No, I don't think there's a thing you missed. And but I will say, I think we could do this whole show over again, and you might get a different set of answers, not contradictory answers, but there's a lot that we could talk about. But
For
no,
sure.
I think you've done a lovely job of letting me mouth off for an hour.
Hardly, hardly. I mean, I could listen to you. I tried to veer away from like too much asking about specific shows and their processes because I think that just sort of opens Pandora's box and there's too much to talk about. And I know that also um, people don't love, especially when you've worked as much as you have, people don't love picking favorites of their shows that they've worked on. So
I
I,
don't.
I try not to do that too much. Well, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure. Tune in next week for another incredible guest. And in a couple weeks, we'll have another special episode focused on a specific play or musical soon to be announced. So thank you so much.